Aloha, everyone. Try that one more time. Aloha, everybody. Aloha. Welcome to Hula Alapa'i Pūlama, a tribute to Maui's living coral reefs. That was a mouthful. I'll say it one more time. Hula Alapa'i Pūlama, a tribute to Maui's coral reefs. This evening is a celebration of Maui's living coral reefs, and we have a very special evening, including performances by Hula Alapa'i Malu'ulolele of Ka o Hawai'i Nei Institute. I had to make sure I said that one right because Auntie Roselle's sitting right there. Right? Okay. Aside from a presentation by the Hulau, we have Rhiannon Chandler, Dr. Mark Hixon, Dr. Bob Richmond, and Russell Sparks, but I'm going to call him Dr. Russell Sparks this evening as well. I don't want him to feel left out. Right, Dr. Sparks? Okay, so first I want to start with an overview of who is Maui Nui Marine Resource Council. That's MNMRC, because we all love acronyms. So I got to tell a quick story. Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, actually, my dad was one of those who started this. It started with a canoe paddle in our family's backyard with my 4-year-old son and my dad being pulled on the side of the canoe behind the yako as we were paddling around. He noticed there was some trouble in the ocean. Fish in abundance were lacking, corals looked funny, things were just not what they should be. So that was the impetus for some change and a catalyst for the beginning Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, along with Robin Newbold, who has been spearheading the organization after my dad's passing in 2010. That's almost 10 years, wow. Anyway, so who is Maui Nui Marine Resource Council? They do a lot of stuff. Their vision: healthy coral reefs, clean ocean water, and abundant native fish. They do some really cool stuff like water quality testing with Hui o Kawaiʻola. They test 41 sites in South and West Maui, and that came about because the Department of Health can only do once every now and then. So you're definitely lacking in water quality testing, and as we all know, we need to have clean water so that we can swim and put the water in your mouth and not worry about what's going in your mouth. As a kid, we used to dip mango in the ocean and eat it because it's salty. Now you don't like dip your mango in the ocean and eat it because you don't know what's in that water, right? Some of the other things that we do is the Ma'alaya Mauka and Makai work that's been addressing this po'akea. Because of the wildfires upslope and introducing some oysters, some bivalves to help and eliminate some of the water problems that they have there. And so it's a huge project that's going on, but you can't just do the water, you have to do upslope too. So, these slides, they move fast, huh? Some of the other things we do is they support community managed Makai area networks, and that includes the Maui Nui Makai network. They support 7 of the sites, 2 in Molokai, 1 in Lanai, 2 in Hana, 1 in Wailuku, and 1 in Lahaina, which is Polanui in my family's backyard. So they support the awareness campaign. We have the next event, as you may have saw the slide earlier. Next event is going to be November 13, Maui Ocean Center at the Sphere, which is going to be talking about wildfires and sediment. That starts at 5:30. That should be really cool because you see that mountain, how brown it is. I'd hate to see that go down into the ocean. So it's just hopefully some of the weeds grow back to hold that back in. But Maui Nui Marine Resource Council has a project to help mitigate some of that stuff. Learn more at mauireefs.org. I want to thank our grantors and everyone who makes this possible through their donations, especially Maui County Mayor's Office of Economic Development, which funded this evening's event and many of our projects. Maui Ocean Center, Marine Institute for providing the live coral tanks. Amy, Deja, Don, Steve, and all the staff and volunteers here at Iao Theater, all of our donors that make this work possible. I also want to recognize the Maui Nui Marine Resource staff and their board of directors. Please stand up. These guys are hard at work. The staff works awesome. I mean, see the stuff that they do. I'm like, oh, wow, you get time for yourself. So on with the show. So why don't you introduce her, the Hulau. It's my cousin Sharon. I grew up with these guys. I grew up with Auntie Roselle teaching hula in our backyard in the patio and watching my cousin Sharon and my cousin Poha dance together along with their mom. And I thought it was one of the most beautiful things that you could see. Hula with your family in your backyard, holding the traditions and culture strong and propagating that far into the future by reaching way back into the past and bringing that forward. I also saw my mom and my sister dance together. And I thought that was the most beautiful thing as well. As they grew up, my little sister at 4 years old was practicing well into, I don't say how old she is now, but she's still dancing hula. Yeah, so it's beautiful to see them dance together. And I want to introduce to you Hula Alapa'i, Malu'ulolele of Ka Nainoa o Hawai'i Nei Institute. Their kumu is Auntie Roselle Kilihonipua Bailey, and my cousin Sharon Iwana Bailey. So, Bali Doi, thank you. Sharon.
Aloha and greetings to everyone here and to our ancestors who came before us, and of course to our kuleana to take care of the animals and the plants here on our planet Earth. So that's our greeting to you tonight. Our plan is to introduce each speaker just before they come up with hula, oli, song, or a short story. So our little dance will lead into the pathway to our next speaker. As Ekolu said, we're cousins. My mom, where's my mom? Oh, she's over there. And hi, parents, they're very supportive. And growing up with Ekolu and Auntie Punani, uncle brother, so we call Edwin Lindsay Jr. uncle brother. His wife is Auntie Punani. Where's Auntie Punani? Right here. So she's gonna dance with us later. And so Ekolu is the third, and we're going to bring into and complete the cycle of the first one. My grandfather composed the first song that we're gonna do, Mo'olele, for the double horse sailing canoe in Lahaina. So we're gonna take you on a journey tonight. E holo holo kako makawa'akaulua mo'olele o Lahaina. Lelele I ka moana, ke ho eu mai nei. Ka pe'a I ka makani moa e puni kako Hawai'i. Huna hele mako o ka wa'akaulua mo'olele. Mo'olele, mo'olele ha'aheo ko hele ana. Ko pe'a kia kahi, piha I ka makani. Mo'olele, mo'olele ha'aheo ko hele ana. Ko pe'a kia kahi, piha I ka makani. O e no halua like o ka wa'a o nā kupuna. I ka imi aina ho, ma ka hiki mai. O lako no ka ike mua o ke ia aina nani. Nā moku o Hawai'i Nei a o Maui no ka oi. Mo'olele, mo'olele ha'aheo ko hele ana. Ko pe'a kia kahi, kai mali e lie. Kau kai o mo'olele i ke ia mai. Hano hano no ia hai o ka wa'akau lua mo'olele. Mo'olele, mo'olele ha'ahe o ko hele ana. Ko pea kia kahi, iha i ka makani e pai. E pai ka ko makaana kaliko one konoi. Mahalo nui a oe me ko haku ke ola. Mahalo nui a oe me ko haku ke ola.
I remember my grandfather writing that song at the kitchen table. Sitting at the kitchen table with his steno notepad, with his beautiful penmanship, and his ukulele strumming. So we used to take care of that canoe in our backyard. I was a guy that used to have to go bail it every time it rained. I didn't like doing that because there's a lot of work. You know, when you're 10 years old, you just like go swim. Like Bill Kanuwara. Anyway, introducing our speaker is going to be Rhiannon Chandler. Now, Ray is very eloquent, very well spoken. Just got her law degree recently. She speaks fluent in Hawaiian, and I'm just so impressed by her presence that I have the honor to introduce her. She will be talking about the cultural importance of our coral reefs. Mahalo, Ray.
Mahalo piha. I can't imagine a more appropriate and beautiful opening to this day and evening. As you know, today the Supreme Court case is getting decided about our reefs here on Maui and the future of clean water. And so this is such a beautiful tribute to not only the coral reefs, but also this beautiful organization called Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, and this halau's deep connection to the origin of this organization is so beautiful. And so thank you to the Lindsay family, the Bailey family that have guided this organization through until now. Ola nā papa I Pūlama ia. We would not be here without our reefs, and we are so grateful to the reefs and to all the hands that have put together this evening. So, as the chant that we just heard mentioned, that is a part of the Kumulipo. The Kumulipo speaks to the origin of the people and of all plants and animals that we live here on these islands with. And it starts from Po, from the darkness. O ke au I ka huli vela ka honua, at the time when the earth became hot. o ke au I ka huliloli ka lani, at the time when the heavens turned about. It later goes on to say, po vale ho'i, nothing but night. Hanau ka po, the night gave birth. The first thing that it gave birth to was the coral polyp. Hanau ka uku ko'a ko'a. Uku is like speaking to the fact that it is a part of this ko'a ko'a, the new life, the larval phase of it. And then hanau kana he a ko'a ko'a puka. So the coral came after, and the coral polyp and the coral live together and build the reef structures that become the foundation of all life. So not only do we know from the Kumulipo that the coral was the first thing born from the night, it later goes on to talk about the relationships and the partnerships between the things that are born on land and the things that are born in the ocean, and the relationship between those two. Hanau ka he'e nohoi kai, kia ia e ka ala he'e nohoi uka. So the he'e is born in the ocean, but it's guarded by its companion, the ala he'e, that's born in the mountain. And it goes on to say, hanau ka lau milo nohoi kai, kia ia e ka milo nohoi uka. So it's born is the puhi, actually, the eel with the yellow head in the ocean, guarded by the milo tree in the land. And what it is calling upon is the balance. And it's reminding us that we are the kia'i, that these things that are born on the land have a kuleana to care for the ocean. And in fact, so much of what's happening to our ocean right now is because of the things that are happening on the land. And so foundationally, from the very beginning, there was a paramount respect for coral reefs, that it is the oldest living ancestor to all things, that it was a critical foundation of the development of the culture because it provided food, protection, medicinal resources, and really an amazing laboratory for the study of the balance of nature. I mean, if you overuse the resource, it's so obvious on the coral reefs, and that's what we're seeing today. Nearshore fisheries were regularly regulated under this kapu system to ensure the proper care and management of the reefs because they were so important. The coral itself was revered so much that it was presented as an offering during religious ceremonies and also as a gesture of peace in war, or a choice between war and peace would be a choice between a black stone and a piece of coral that showed when you return the coral that you wanted peace. I don't know how much deeper we could assign life to coral than that. So the protection and maintenance of this reef system is really central to the continuation of the Hawaiian way of life. Because on these islands of Hawaii, where we are the most isolated landmass in the entire planet, everything around us is a part of our culture. And we cannot continue culture without the resources that we depend upon. And so natural resources or cultural resources, as you saw in the hula today, people, the dancers and the kumua are wearing the kupe'e, a symbol of a very important marine resource that lives in the ocean, and the sounds of it remind us of the stories that we pass on from generation to generation. If we don't have that kupe'e, we cannot actively continue those cultural practices. And so healthy reefs and marine ecosystems sustain the unique culture of Hawaii, and we need all of those individual plants and animals in order to continue those practices. And we have a lot of uniqueness, which makes it amazing. I mean, we have 10,000 native species. More than 25% of our marine species are found nowhere else on Earth. And in fact, in some areas, it's even higher than that. I mean, there's a place in Papahanaumokuakea, the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, where on one reef, a study at about 300 feet elevation depth underwater, so a little bit further offshore, 50% of the life they found in 2 years is found nowhere else on Earth. 50%. And so as we start to lose our marine resources, we're losing things before we even knew that they existed. And so reefs provide so much more than anything that we could even imagine. Without our reefs, we wouldn't have sand. Beach sand is primarily made of coral fragments, shells, urchins, calcified algae, and other marine organisms. And our living reefs are shaping the waves. As we all know, surfing originated in Hawaii, and it's our reefs that allowed those incredible waves that we have. The famous places here on Maui and across our islands wouldn't exist as surfing spots without the reefs that make them possible. And Aina Momona, our abundance of life, and in fact, on every island except for Oahu, we had comparable populations pre-contact to the amount of people who are living here now, but there was no Costco or Safeway or anywhere to get anything. You had to live within your means, and in this case, you had to malama your reef. You had to really actively care for the things that maintain life. And in the case of the coral reefs and fishing practices, there was so much acute study of life cycles and vulnerabilities of unique species, and kapu was set according to what that life needed, not what we needed, not what we wanted, but what that species needed, because our very survival on these islands ensured was dependent upon those reefs and the life that they provided. Here on Maui, Oluwalu is our mother reef. It is nearly 600 years old and over 1,000 acres in size. And from Maui, studies have shown that corals there spread to the rest of the islands, forming reefs that have sustained robust populations and generations of people on these islands. If we didn't have the Oluwalu Reef, we wouldn't have life in so many other areas, and we will not have life in so many areas if we lose this reef. It's critically important to the future of our marine resources. There are so many relationships that are made possible because of the reef. And for example, the practice of hanai, which is adoption, is actually, it originates from the term hanai, which is to feed, because when you're adopting someone, you're feeding them. But the practice of hanai is a practice that happened in the water with marine life, and particularly with the opelu, which often was under a kapu at the same time as the aku, because they're prey and predator. And at the same time, the feeding would be building a relationship with this fish that later they would catch some of, but not all of, right? And so you are part of a reciprocal process, honoring that life, knowing that it's giving to you, but really you're adding abundance into the system by feeding and caring for those animals. It's the idea that you take in a way that you're not taking away from the system. And so, for example, with the mano, which were regarded as guardians, the sharks were aumakua, and they were sometimes reared from infancy. This is an excerpt from a book. It was published in 2003 from stories from the early 1900s. And it says that, like faithful dogs, they would follow their masters while in or upon the ocean. Many a tale is told of how faithful sharks saved the lives of their keepers by bearing them ashore on their backs. I mean, it sounds almost like, how is that possible? How could you feed a shark from birth? But in my own family, my great-grandmother had a shark that followed her back and forth in Moorea, that every day when she went across one point of Opunohu Bay to the other with her canoe, that shark would go with her on the way and come back in the evening. And later on in her life, when she was in the waters of the bay where she was born, and her husband was trying to mess around with her in the water and hold her down and made her scared, a shark came out of nowhere, swam in between his legs, freaked him out, and he let her go, and he never messed with her again. So I think that we have a lot to learn about relationships, and certainly relationship with nature that we can't even begin to contemplate sometimes. So what is the opposite of, that? It's really the total loss of everything around you. And so coral reef decline severs relationships, and it prevents the transmission of cultural knowledge. There is nothing here to teach someone about except our mistakes. This is a very sad situation for future generations, and unfortunately, under the water all over the main Hawaiian Islands, it looks like this. And so how will we say what the kapu practice was for certain fish? How will we know when they spawn if they're not around because we didn't take care of their habitats? So climate change adds just a whole new level of challenges to the reef that the reef was already facing before climate change. So land-based sources of pollution like sediment and pesticides and all kinds of things that happen in agriculture have smothered the reefs for many years. But on top of that, there's invasive seaweeds, there's sunscreen chemicals, there's lots of people in the water stepping on coral, and there's overfishing of the herbivores that they need. So as if that wasn't enough, now the temperature is rising, and unfortunately corals are bleaching all over our islands. And we are the endangered species capital of the world, even without climate change. We have 526 plants and animals listed as endangered. We are the highest rate of endangered species per square mile in the world, and more than 20% of the listed species on the planet are from Hawaii. Our culture is endangered, along with all of these species. So what is our kuleana? Our kuleana is to adjust and adapt to the needs of our rapidly changing environment. Everything is changing around us, and we have to change with it. Our practices and our oral traditions are messages from our ancestors of how to live sustainably on one reef, one island, one nation, one planet. We know that it's possible because we did, but really we did it by putting nature first, and we have to recognize that relationship in order to make it into the future. So as the Kumulipo says, kia'i, the kai, protect our ocean resources for future generations. In the face of climate change, we have to utilize adaptive management and Native Hawaiian principles like malama aina and kilo observation, kapu, to restrict the access. So malama really means to take care of. It means to preserve, protect, save, maintain, but it's an active word. Uncle Ed used to say it's an adjective. It's a verb. You're doing something. Malama is not just something you say. You're like doing it. And aina, which means land, but it also really means land that we eat from, land that sustains us. So there's moku, which sometimes has no life and life-sustaining features. It would be moku. Aina is where people are living and that land is feeding the people. And so in that worldview, land is not property. It's actually treated as a part of a living system, and various parts of nature and inanimate objects are physical manifestations of spiritual forces or akua. So if you're looking at a tree and you're seeing something that you revere, if you're seeing a deity physically manifest in something, if you recognize and honor the life force and the respect and reverence for that thing, it's not something to have, take, and destroy. It's something to revere. And just that ideology has kept life on these islands for so long. Resources were for subsistence. So that practice, only take what you need. It wasn't only taking what you needed, it was also replanting along the way and restoring, taking limu so that you didn't uproot the roots and prevent it from growing in the future. Taking and gathering in ways, because these were not your resources, they were akua's resources that were shared by everyone. He ali'ika aina he kaua ke kanaka. People can only exist if the aina and the ecosystems are healthy and abundant to support them. So fishing kapu were a form of malama aina. Kapu was practiced in so many ways with different varieties of fish, fishing areas, different times of spawning. These are really important practices for us to adopt not only on the land but also in the ocean. And really effective conservation is the direction that we have to go in, and it's a product of so much. We no longer can do these things on our own. It requires stakeholder support, active management, protection of areas, and partnerships between community, government, nonprofits, and researchers. And next, I would say, and leave you with this. Please listen to the scientists. The scientists are going to come after me, but what they are saying is so important. And if you can take this message outside of this room, what the scientists are telling us about our future, we need to pay attention to that today so that we can ensure the continuation of these practices. Mahalo.
Thank you, Ray. So our next speaker will be talking about the importance of uhu, or parrotfish, to our coral reef ecosystems. Dr. Mark Hixon has been recognized as the most cited American scientific author on coral reefs. He had plenty of stuff after his name for the things that he's been awarded and that he's done. And I think as a person, he's a compassionate man. He grew up in the ocean. He loves the ocean. In fact, when he was 4 years old, he had a dream. He was down in the ocean and there was no water, but the fish, the whales, the dolphins are still swimming around, and he immersed himself as he walked out. And that was the beginning of his life in the ocean. Dr. Mark Hixon.
So we have a hula and a song, and an little no'eo for the uhu. Hamau aiki awahi no hoa ona au ia oe iho I ke kai holo o gala au e hoi ke mai o ka loa a ole ke la lau nei kau kino lana ke hoi nei ke kai ke la lau nei kau kilo lana e hoi nei ke kai mai ho Iao iho I hanu mai na malihini ka lia ho ea mai ka ulula au hau mai ho pokole kau I ini a ho ea mai kau kino lana mai ho pokole kau I ini a ho ea mai kau kino lana ke o ili nei ke peahi nei lana lana o kala au ko aku ko mai a hiki ia wahi o nā malihini o ka vai hua hua kau I aloha ho ole upena ho ole hei nā malihini ha ina ia mai ana kapua na ua paa ka uha alili nei ha ina ho ia mai na ua paana maka upena ho ole hei a hei a hei a hei a no na moi ai hei a no na moi ka moi Oriana, our Lawai'a, please stand up. Our Lawai'a cast her net. Hui, Oriana, come, we're going to sing now. She cast her net, not for uhu. She cast it for moi, which is fit for a mo'i, which is, wait, what is moi? And I had to look it up. Wait. I have notes because I don't know what it is. In Pacific threadfin, is that right? Yeah, moi. It's a silver fish. It's really good in the reefs. It was saved for the royalty, mo'i. So uhu, I believe, you usually catch with a spear. So we are going to sing a song, He Ono. And it sings about, well, one fish that's out far, but most of the reef fish and how ono they are. But it's really telling us that perhaps you don't have to go far away or out into the depths to find the really ono things. They might be right in front of you, right inside the reef. He ono a he ono a he ono I ono ono no a he ono no he ono a he ono a he ono I ono ono a he ono no ke waka ono ma ke alo pikola kahi mo mona piko pane nui hali hali havale te mo moni akula o ka o Io halale ke kaina o ka o pelu e pepe nuanala he ona taumi tau I tau o puku te mo moni atu he ono a he ono a he ono I ono ono a he ono no mai pi koe oi I ke a kulela a hei ngā ahai ko ho honula ho I ho oi kahi anai me ka manini kure huia o ke kole o kai a maka ona ona la e ono tau mita ho I tau tau o puku te mamonia he ono a he ono a he ono I ono ono a he ono no. Oh, I got so distracted in that song because I heard of the kole and the manini, and it made me think of my grandmother. Those were her favorite fish to fry. Don't ask me. They're kole and manini, whatever those are. You know what they are? Yeah? Okay. So I did look up an olelo no Īao for uhu, because we're presenting the pathway to uhu. And it says, akahi ho'i ku'u ono ka uhu ka alo I ku'u maka. Yeah, I did it. Which means, oh, now I long for the ono uhu fish that has passed before my eyes. Which really means, oh, that's a handsome bugger. I would like to have him as my sweetheart. So the uhu fish is beautiful, the male uhu fish. It's that blue, beautiful color. And they're very ono, and they're hard workers. So it's a good catch.
Mahalo. Aloha. It's such an honor to be here. I'm just so enthused by the number of people on all the islands who are starting to really very much appreciate the state of our oceans and what must be done. My message tonight is very simple. If we want to save our coral reefs, we must simultaneously save those fishes that eat the seaweeds. So my point tonight is to share several truths that have been well documented by science and discuss what these truths tell us we must do. So as we know, our reefs, which are so incredibly valuable to us in so many ways, are being threatened and are degrading very rapidly. Just last year, one of the most beautiful coral reefs on the planet, up at French Frigate Shoals in Papahanau, Mokuakea, was literally wiped off the face of the earth by Hurricane Walaka, one of the most powerful Category 5 hurricanes to ever strike the islands. Here in the main Hawaiian Islands, as we know, various types of pollutants, sewage, fertilizers, whatever comes out of injection wells, as well as sediment is killing reefs. And then on top of everything else, of course, this ever-warming, acidifying ocean that is going to be accelerating through time. We ain't seen nothing yet, unfortunately. So what can we do? There is actions we can take, and it starts with fostering those little baby coral polyps. This little video shows a coral colony in just the 2 polyp stage. It's only a little tiny thing, a couple millimeters in diameter. And these baby corals, these larvae that settle, have to settle on clean seafloors, and sometimes very specific seafloors. And if we don't foster our seafloors, we're not going to have baby corals settling. It's as simple as that. So a few truths, very well documented by science. First is that seaweeds inhibit corals. And when I say seaweeds, I mean everything from the very large, sort of weedy things, all the way down to these little fine turfs that accumulate sediment. They're known to inhibit the ability of baby corals to settle and grow. So the photo on the left is a nice clean reef. There's living coral as well as these dead coral surfaces that are being kept clean. On the right is limu growing in between those living pieces of finger coral sticking out. Where the limu takes over and takes hold, corals can never grow again. Something has to remove them. So this is the second truth. It's the herbivores, herbivores being the scientific name for seaweed eaters, are absolutely essential for our reefs. This photograph shows a whole bunch of surgeonfishes except for one individual fish. You can figure out which one it is. All these species, and there's about 24 of them in Hawaii, most of which eat limu, and they have a whole variety of Hawaiian names, are seaweed cleaners. These are the lawnmowers of the sea, if you will. One of the largest among the surgeonfishes is the kala, unicorn fish, a very important grazer on our reefs. The other major groups of fish that eat limu are the chubs, or nainua, very important browsers. Sometimes, I'm not going to get into the literature tonight, but there's different types of herbivores. There's things that are called excavators, some are called scrapers, some are called grazers, some are called browsers. It all depends upon which limu they eat and how they eat it. And then my favorite, and the most important of all the herbivores, the parrotfishes, or uhu. Parrotfishes are the champion herbivores on the reef because of those amazing beaks they have. Their teeth, and they always look very happy too, their teeth are fused so that they actually have just 2 upper teeth and 2 lower teeth that are literally form a beak, hence the name parrotfish. And with that, they really clean the reef. They do the razor cleaning of the reef to create those nice open surfaces for baby corals to settle and grow. And they do more than that. Not only are they sitting there eating away, but when they're done eating and scraping that dead coral, they poop sand. Parrotfish are some of the main sand producers on our reefs. A single large parrotfish can generate almost half a ton of sand per year. These are sand makers on our reefs. So if you think about it, parrotfishes give us 2 wonderful free services. They produce less seaweed, which allows more space for corals to grow, and then they poop sand, which enhances our beaches and produces less erosion. Free gift from Mother Nature. But parrotfishes are severely overfished in the main Hawaiian Islands, which means more seaweed, less space for corals to grow, less sand production, and greater coastal erosion. What the ocean has taught me more than anything else through my entire career is that everything is connected. And the role of uhu shows me that as well as anything else. So the bad part is that our herbivores are severely depressed. And this is true throughout the main Hawaiian Islands. Now, I'm a scientist, so I have to show at least one graph, and this is it. So this will take a little time to go through, but it's a very important graph. This was work conducted by my colleague Alan Friedlander when he was at University of Hawaii. Each one of these bars represents the abundance of fish, measured as the weight of fish, in different locations in the main islands, except for the bar on the far left, the pinkish purplish one. That's Papahanau Mokuakea. That's never fished. Look at those abundance patterns. The most abundant groups of fish on the main islands is less than half the abundance on Papahanaumokuakea. So the green bars, the gray bars, and the orange bars are different locations around the main Hawaiian Islands that were sampled in this study. Now the dashed line you see, parallel, that says relative overfish threshold, that's comparing 20% of what grows in Papahanaumokuakea. That's our sort of unfished baseline. And fisheries biologists will say that once a population's fish below that 20% threshold, it's considered overfished. That is, the population is in danger of collapsing. The green bars represent those locations in the main islands that are above that threshold. And if you look at the inset map, it's those little green blotches you see here and there scattered over our islands. The gray bars and the orange bars are below the threshold, overfished. And the orange bars are severely overfished. And you can see that's a good part of Maui and most of Oahu. So no one can argue that our fish populations are just fine. They're not. They may seem fine because some people know where to catch fish still, and some people are still bringing in fish, but it's nothing like it used to be. And most of these fish are herbivores. So those are all truths that have been documented by science. And the question then is, what can we do? Well, what we can do is save the uhu and other herbivores. And when I say that, I don't mean stop fishing. Anyone should be able to go out and catch a nice dinner for themselves. But what has to stop is outright pillaging. These guys are not poor fishermen. These are scuba divers. It takes money to be a scuba diver, who went out at night and spearfished on scuba gear the uhu while they were sleeping in their holes and a bunch of other reef fish. This is one reef being wiped out overnight. I can't tell you specifically where this is, but I can tell you what this is called. This is called bombing a reef. They have a name for it. This is the kind of thing that has to stop. And if you don't want to take my word for it, you'll have to take it directly from the uhu itself.
That you guys know that we taste good with some pepper, some shoyu, and some ginger. That's my cousin Pasquale. Brother, we make one deal. You know what he does? And we make you the sand. And you guys, we know, bro, you like the sand. And
a friend sent that to me. I have no idea who produced it, but I love it. So what can we do? Well, this is a list of 60 nations and regions of the world where the use of scuba gear with spearfishing has been banned. And it's been banned for good reason, because scuba spearfishing men are extremely efficient at removing fish from reefs, especially at night when the fish are sleeping. So this is why they've done that. Here, you can scuba spearfish all you want. Just that one action alone would save many of our herbivores. There's nothing pono about scuba spearfishing. There's also the idea of closing areas and allowing herbivore populations to replenish, and that's what we have here on Maui with kahikili, and it's working. The herbivores, the uhu, surgeon fishes, chubs are all coming back. The amount of limu, seaweed is declining, and conditions are improving for corals. So we need areas like that, especially we need big fish. There's studies that have been done on the value of what are called boffs. Boffs are big, old, fat, fertile female fish, boffs. And these animals produce far more offspring and often better quality offspring than smaller fish, even of the same amount or mass of fish. So we need not only some closed areas for replenishment, but we need to get rid of wasteful fishing practices. And this will involve not just enforcement, but also education. I believe most people, if they knew these truths, would buy in to saving our animals. Now, given that that's true, there's going to be pushback. There's been attempts before to ban scuba spearfishing. It was done in a region on the Kona coast that was vicious, just horribly vicious. And there will be those who will fight any kind of action like this. So besides the information I've given you already, there's a couple fallacies that are out there that I'd like to dispel. I'm calling them wrong myths. Wrong myth number one, people will claim that uhu eat live coral. Yes, they occasionally will bite live coral, but almost all their bites are on those dead coral surfaces, because what they eat, what they digest, is not coral polyps, but on the dead coral surfaces, the algae that not only grows on the surface, but also grows down in the little tiny fine pukas on the dead coral surface. That's what their teeth are designed to do, to scrape that or excavate it so they can eat that. So they are not a threat to corals. The second myth is that there's a deep water refuge for the uhu. We can take all the uhu we want from shallow water because there's always a lot more in deep water. They move up where we can catch them. In a recent graduate student's PhD thesis, Corey Kane showed by diving on every one of the main Hawaiian islands except for Kauai and Kaho'olawe, showed that, in fact, as you go deeper and deeper and deeper into these what are called mesophotic depths, hundreds of feet deep, there's not more uhu. In fact, there's fewer herbivores for two reasons. There's less reef structure for the holes for them to hide in, and there's less limu to eat. So each one of these dots you see on this graph is one sample, one dive, in all these different parts around the islands. The black vertical line you see there at about just over 66 feet or so, everything to the left of that is 90% of the herbivores that we're seeing. That is shallow water. If you go into deep water, especially beyond the red line there on the x-axis, that's deeper than most divers go, and there's not much out there, as you can see. So herbivores are less abundant in deep water. There is no deep water refuge. We have to act on shallow water and save the uhu and the other herbivores if we want our reefs to recover, if we want to keep them safe as the ocean's conditions get worse and worse. So ultimately, the ancient Hawaiians knew the truth, care for the ocean, and the ocean will care for us. This is a call to action. We must bring this truth not only to our communities, but also to our politicians and demand action. Time is short. The conditions are worsening very rapidly. We need the uhu and their friends. This is about the coming generations. Mahalo.
Thank you, Dr. Hixon. That was very enlightening to know that a large male uhu, a half ton of sand. Wow. I don't know what a half ton of sand looks like, but it must be a lot. Our next speaker, Dr. Bob Richmond, will be talking about corals that seem to withstand anything and the sounds of coral reefs. Dr. Richmond is the Maui Coral Recovery Team, chair of the Maui Coral Recovery Team convened by the Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, and is the co-author of the 2015 Maui Coral Recovery Plan. I first met Dr. Richmond at the Maui Coral Reef Recovery meeting, and I had a hard time understanding what he was saying because he was talking on a microscopic level, and when in the community standpoint, we're looking at the fish you eat. But after going around a few times and him being patient and explaining to me the importance of the health of coral reef structures is directly related to the health of the fish that you're eating, I was like, oh, I get it now. So thank you, Dr. Richmond.
So no matter how murky the water is or what the climate is, there are some coral that are resilient. And our Hula Alapa'i was a call to hold on fast to those things which you treasure that knowledge that you have from your ancestors and to the land. So like in the Kumulipo, where the ocean bodies have land counterpart or guardian, like these coral that are resilient, I'm going to say that we are the land people that are resilient as well. And I think that each one of us here has our ancestral knowledge and the gifts from wherever we are from. We all have them. And to bring them to the table as we find solutions and holomua. If you know this hula and you'd like to come up and dance with us, you're most welcome to. Or you can stand anywhere in historic Iao Theater and join us.
Ai, aua ia e tama e tona motu.
Aua ia e tama e tona motu, o tona motu e tama aua ia, te tama 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 i ta hulinu, o te tama 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 i ta hulio, hulihi a papio a i lalo i ke alo, hulihia i ka imu, o tū tamatihi lohe lohe. O ka hana na i hiki o hula hula, ka ia ka noi, o ka pohaku. Me ka upena ku aku i huani ani, o ka ulu o niu o lani o la a, o ke ave ai ku ai ala ahia. Aua ia e tama e tona motu, o tona motu e tama taua ia, o te tama 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 e ta hulinu, te tama 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 e ta hulinu, hulihi a papio i lalo i ke alo, hulihi a i ka iku o tū tamati lolo, o ka hana na ia hiki o hula hula, ka ia ka rohi o ka pohaku, me ka pena kua uani ni o ka ulu o ni o lani o la a o ke ave ai ku ai a la ahia.
Nana i hala pepe i ka hunga o ka no. I hare ia ke hio wela, ka kuku wela lohi a o kanalo.
Aloha and mahalo so much for the opportunity to be here this evening. It's always very encouraging to see people come out on a Wednesday. I guess we should be glad it's not Monday or Tuesday and competing with The Voice. But for all of you that came tonight, I'm very grateful for the fact that you would come and spend an evening with people who really care about reefs and most importantly, the people who depend on them. I've used my title to address what I was asked to talk about, including a tribute to corals. But for me, it's always very much a matter of legacy as well. I had the opportunity to work on coral reefs now for going on 47 years, which is interesting because I'm only 50, but almost. I've been working on the reefs of Hawaii since 1979. And earlier this year, I got a chance to work in Aotearoa with the Maui community on some marine resource issues. And one of the elders said it as eloquently as I've ever heard, is what we do is for those who came before us, those that are here today, but most importantly for those yet to come. And hence the way Ray and others have discussed it, the reason why many of us do what we do is because we are very concerned about the future, not only as scientists and cultural practitioners and managers, but as parents and as members of the community. So as Kolu alluded to, I often work with things that are very small. In Maui, you're very familiar with what's called from ridge to reef. The work that I do on corals is actually from molecules to ecosystems. Molecules you can't see, so we have some tools that we use to try to figure out what's going on. And so when we look at a coral, what we often are looking at is the reef, but sometimes you can't see the coral through the reef. So we've developed some very interesting tools to be able to really ask what's going on a coral reef, and more importantly, to try to figure out what we need to do going forward. As Mark talked about in his presentation, there's a number of stressors on coral reefs, Ray as well. This was where I did my doctoral dissertation on Nainoa Atoll in the Marshall Islands. When you talk about the extremes of human disturbance, vaporization via nuclear warhead is kind of right up there. So these are some of the reefs I worked on in the early 80s that were literally vaporized off the face of the earth. But interestingly enough, diving in the bomb craters, these were caused in the 1950s. The corals had come back nicely. The sharks were still pretty ticked off. That white dome you see is what's called the run-it dome. There was a little bit of a mistake in the calculations. The half-life for the shortest-lived radionuclide in these bomb craters is 5,000 years. The half-life for concrete is 50. And so the Marshall Islands is having some serious concerns now as this dome cracks. The more subtle forms of damage that we see are things we see all the time, even around Maui, upper left-hand corner, sediment coming from a small stream after a storm. As Mark pointed out very eloquently, overfishing, especially the herbivores, the lawnmowers. The lower left-hand corner is a sewer outfall on Guam. I've dove every sewer outfall in the Pacific Islands. I'm working on a coffee table book, which is bound to be a bestseller. But it's a freshwater effluent that surfaces 100% of the time. This particular sewer outfall is about 20 meters off the reef. You can literally throw a rock into it. What you can see are the particulates. What you can't see are personal care products, unmetabolized estrogen from things like birth control pills that confuse organisms as to when to reproduce, and a lot of chemicals that come out as well. And then the lower right-hand corner, you can see the recreational impacts that are no surprise to the people of Maui. So the persistence of coral reefs is really dependent upon 6 interconnected steps, each one of which depends on water quality. In this first panel, we see a daytime, early morning spawning of a coral, where this coral colony is releasing both egg and sperm at the same time. It has both male and female characteristics. We call that hermaphrodites. It comes from Greek mythology, Hermes the messenger god. Aphrodite was the goddess of beauty, so you're getting a little bit of Greek mythology with your biology tonight. So these corals release egg and sperm into the water. If all goes well, the egg and sperm will interact. They're chemically mediated to be able to track the right egg and the right sperm to be able to unite. If all goes well, they'll fertilize and become an embryo. The embryo, anywhere between 18 to 72 hours, will turn into a coral seed or larva. If all goes well, that larva will settle, metamorphose, and become the next generation of coral. And for most of these corals, they need to do one extra step, and that's pick up good algae that live inside of them that make them literally solar powered. What we do see then is anything we do to the water quality through runoff, through pesticides, heavy metals, any things that you see after any storm in Maui interferes with each one of these important critical steps that ensures the persistence of reefs. And as a result, much of the work that we do is on water quality, and it turns out that those first 4 stages are very sensitive to water-soluble chemicals. The last 2 are to the sticky chemicals that can bind to the bottom, and coral larvae don't simply randomly settle, and if they picked a good place, they live, and if they picked a bad place, they die. But they're actually tasting the bottom, looking for a chemical cue or a bacterial cue, and if they can't taste the right cue, then they're unable to settle and metamorphose. So it doesn't matter if you have 100% successful fertilization and development. If the larvae can't settle and metamorphose, you get nothing back to the reef. And the way that we see this in the environment, and again, this is no surprise to the people of Maui, is these concentric circles of effect from watershed discharges. Here, the difference between the mountain to the sea is very short. And in that first dark circle, every bit of coral was killed. This is one of my study sites in Guam, where there were about 57 species of corals that lived there. Everything in the first dark circle close to the stream mouth. This is a very small watershed, about 4 square kilometers around. The second one, a few things are still alive but dying back. That third area is where corals are able to grow but not reproduce. A little bit further out, they can begin to reproduce, but the egg and sperm are not of a good quality. A little bit further out, we can see that egg and sperm can interact, but they can't fertilize, or if they do fertilize, the coral larvae can't settle. So what you can see effectively is what's happening on Maui, on Oahu, all throughout the Hawaiian Islands, the main Hawaiian Islands, and any of the high islands, is we're pushing the reef away from shore until it falls over the edge and can't come back. And that's why a number of the projects that we've been involved in here on Maui, up in Waikikuli, Honokauai, Polonui, and now Olowalu, is working on restoration within the watershed with the hope that with every bit of watershed that we recover and protect, we can begin to move these concentric circles back towards land and get the reef to come back to where it should be. One of the areas in which we do work is in what we call the cockroach corals. This was a term coined by one of my graduate students, Narissa Spies. She's a native Hawaiian student who will finish her PhD hopefully this month, works for U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But we have a number of very interesting locations in Hawaii. In the upper left-hand corner is Honolulu Harbor. Hawaii had come up with a new way of killing corals called a molasses spill. I think some of you were aware of it, and that was a surprise to everybody because molasses is not a hazardous waste, and so nobody knew what to do because it's sugar. And so EPA said, well, it's not hazardous, so it's not us. Fish and Wildlife and Department of Health said, well, it's not toxic, so it's not us, but a lot of the corals died. Pearl Harbor, which you know self-respecting coral should live there, and then Malaea Harbor, which you know very well. And so this lower right-hand picture is a coral called Leptastia purpurea. This is the one that Narissa calls her cockroach coral. It lives in all of these places, and this is one of kind of the passwords of our lab, ugly is good. Every morning when I get up, I remind myself when I go to shave a little bit around the neck here. But what I mean by ugly is good is that if you want to figure out where the tough corals are, you go to ugly places. And I can tell you these are three of the ugliest places around for corals, yet we have corals that are thriving there. And the question is, how do they do it? And can we learn from those corals to teach other corals to do the same? So here is my childhood hero. Anybody recognize the guy on the left? Somebody, yeah, okay, you admit it. You're old. All right. The guy on the left is Rex Harrison. He was the Dr. Doodle I grew up with. For those of you in the younger generation, the guy on the right, I understand they're first cousins once removed. But the work we do can best be described as Dr. Doodle meets CSI. What we do is develop techniques to actually ask the corals, and when I ask people, you know, what was so cool about Dr. Doolittle, they said, well, he could talk to animals. That's what the song says. I've got 2 dogs, and I talk to them a lot. Don't eat my slippers, don't eat the cat. And so I talk to them and it doesn't make a difference. I need to listen to them. So when they're chewing on my slippers or chewing on the cat, they're communicating to me saying, if you don't give me a belly rub right now, you're gonna pay a price. So the difference between listening and talking is very important. And that's what we do in some of the biology that Ikola was referring to. Typically, the way we study reefs is using death as the indicator of change. This is a series of quadrats in an area of coral damage, and we detect change by how many species we lost or how much coral cover we lost. And death is a very bad indicator of stress. For example, if I have a very stressful day, and I come home and I kiss my wife and she said, how's it going, dear? And I said, I have a very stressful day and I fall over dead. Chances are I should have intervened a little bit earlier. So I do my due diligence. I get my blood pressure checked. I get cholesterol done every year. And this way, if my doctor says, hey, your cholesterol is a little bit too high, let's cut out the beer and pizza, let's run a few days a week, I can intervene before this mortality endpoint. Unfortunately, if we try to treat corals the same way, death is not really telling us much. So this is where Dr. Doolittle comes in, and each one of these 4 panels is a Dr. Doolittle moment on a coral reef, where the first upper left-hand corner is not a chia pet, but exactly what Mark was talking about. This is a coral colony that's completely covered with fleshy algae, and that reef is telling us too many nutrients and no uhu, no herbivores. On the upper right-hand side, you can just see a little bit of a red mark in that coral. It's a crab that lives inside of the coral, and it's actually the bouncer. It protects that coral from crown-of-thorn starfish. Crown-of-thorn starfish love to eat this coral. It's one of their favorites, but they've cut a deal with this crab that they provide them with food and a place to live. And if a crown-of-thorns tries to eat the coral, if you've never seen a starfish gallop, You just have to watch them try to climb on a coral with a crab, and you'll see them really haul. And we use this as another indicator because crabs are related to other arthropods such as cockroaches, and if there's pesticide in the water, the crab will die long before the coral will, so we can use this as another Dr. Dolittle moment. The lower left-hand corner, we see what's called a feather duster worm. They can only live in areas with a lot of dissolved organic carbon or particles of nutrients. If we see them showing up, we know there's a nutrient problem. And finally, in the lower right-hand corner is a young coral larva, and they tell us a lot about an environment. If they can settle on an upper surface, a side surface, or a lower surface, we can pretty much figure out what's going on that reef. Another thing that's really cool about coral reefs is the sound, and most people don't think about it, but if you've ever, Eddie Kamai, some of you may know of him, he had a wonderful video they did called Listen to the Forest. People are used to that. If you're a bird lover, if you work with the Audubon Society, people are used to going out into the forest and listening. You may not see the bird, but you know they're there. This is what happens on a coral reef, and if you listen carefully, if it does work, it doesn't. Okay, let's try again. Yep, there it is. So those sounds are the sound of a healthy reef. That's not a rainstorm. These are crabs and shrimps and other things. These are uhu biting the coral reef. And any good fisher will tell you that they can tell you what's going on a reef by getting in the water and closing their eyes. If you hear this, it's a good sign. A good coral reef should sound like downtown Manila at rush hour. A dead reef has no sound, and so there's a number of ways in which we can understand. And for those of you that are familiar with the famous book, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, that was the punchline, is you get to the springtime, you don't hear birds, you don't hear insects, and that was due to pesticides. So we've been able to take it to the next level using the same kind of tools we use in human medicine, protein expression. This is showing Mauna Bay. There's four circles there, the green, the yellow, and the blue, inside, middle, and outside. And what we do is the same kind of blood test you would do on a person, looking for protein expression, and that can tell us if you have an organophosphate pesticide, if you have hydrocarbons, if you have heavy metals, or if you have pool chemicals. We can now do the Dr. Dolittle science of asking the coral what's wrong. And we can also look at corals genetically, and on the left-hand side, we see Honokawai and Wahikuli sites, where we measure corals inside and outside next to each other. And then we have Mauna Bay, and we learned something very scary this come around, is that the corals that are next to each other have less genetic affinity for one another than they do with corals that are 100 miles away due to stress. What the punchline for this one is that we're losing genetic variability in corals and coral reefs, and that tells us that one morning we'll wake up, things will be gone, and we didn't know it was coming. We look at species diversity, which is easy to see with your eyes, but we can't tell the genetic diversity within a coral unless we use some of these molecular techniques. This is what it looks like to us. Very self-explanatory, I don't need to explain it. But what it is, we call them our subway maps. If you look at this, this is basically a two-dimensional plot of every biological function in a living organism. And by looking at where these circles are and where these bars light up, we can tell if it's an oxygen problem, if it's a toxicant problem, if it's a sediment problem or nutrient problem. So we reached a whole new level of being able to understand and treat corals. And I'll end with this one graph which shows my entire life in one slide. And this doesn't, I know what it says about me, but on the x-axis down here, this is the year 1900, the year 2009, where we have the data up here, and then up to the year 2100. I admit I didn't collect the data in the year 1900, but I did collect some of the data in 2009. And this shows us four scenarios. This is for 263 reefs in the Pacific. In the year 1900, they had 80% coral cover. By the year 2009, they were down to 38%. So we had lost over half of the coral cover. If everything were to remain the same, the red line shows us that we hit zero by the year 2070. It doesn't matter what decade, what matters is the slope of the line. And if we add global warming, then we see that it happens much earlier. The upscale here shows that if we do things like watershed restoration and herbivore protection, coral larvae can settle, they can begin to grow, and we start to get some improvement in the reef and coral cover again. But our estimate now is 2050, it actually may be earlier, when climate change really clicks in. The upper one is what happens just with the temperature change. The blue line shows what happens with ocean acidification as the pH drops. And then the last one is showing if we were to get our act together in controlling local stressors like watershed discharges and getting herbivorous fish populations up, and we're able to fix climate change reasonably, and it's not all on the biologists. There's some very smart people at MIT and Caltech working on sequestration of CO2, so I'm a firm believer the only choice will be helping the corals build up at the same time we start to bring CO2 down. But we basically have 5 scenarios for that legacy we leave for future generations. 4 of them take it to oblivion. 1 of them takes it back to about 70% coral cover by the end of the century. And for me, as both a scientist and a parent, there's only one obvious choice there. And that's my take-home message, is corals are threatened but not doomed, and it's totally up to us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Richmond. You always amaze me with the coral facts. You make it simple for us to understand. And that's the first time I've ever seen what your work looked like. Oh my God. And you know, I have a lot of respect for Dr. Richmond because he mentors a lot of local students into the fields, and he has the respect for the cultural layer that's super important to make science great. Yeah, so thank you very much. Our next speaker, Russell Sparks. He's going to be talking about the state of coral bleaching on Maui. Russell is an aquatic biologist of the Division of Aquatic Resources of the state of Hawaii, Department of Land and Natural Resources. He's responsible for the Maui Marine Monitoring Program and for working with stakeholders and communities to develop marine management programs aimed at adaptively managing nearshore fisheries and coral reef resources. So he works with us at the community level to try to help us develop some plans so we can do some of the stuff that's been presented tonight. Yeah. So Russell, thanks for coming up and sharing your mana'o with everybody. Give him a hand, please.
And our hula into this section is Kawai Lehua, composed by Frank Hewitt. So we're going to take the rain that falls, seeps into our honua or runs off into our ocean, and then the cycle that it goes. And now is the time we get to introduce formally Auntie Puanani Lindsay, Uncle Brother's wife, Ekolu's mom, to do Kawai Lehua. We have one more hula. So we're going to combine the fragrance of limo lipoa with the pull of the full moon. And it gets very exciting in the fish ponds in the ehukai. Nani vale a ka mahina o ka lipoa o ka nanaka. Moina ole a ehele ana la hali 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 o ke kai. Hali 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 o ke kai o ka pa. O ka pa ko nane a ka mahina o ola ila ia na I ka pola I. Koni koni ana I ka I vihilo. Hali 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 o ke kai. Hali 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 o ke kai. Haina mai ka pua na lao sa lipoa o ka nanaka. Hoina ole a ehele ana la. Hali 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 o ke kai. Hali 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 o ke kai. Ai oe ai oe ai oe hela. Ai oe ai oe ai oe hela. Ua pa oe ai ka pohaku a ke kanaka. Nā vai ka hana I ka ana I ka pahuana I ka pehuana I ka push ana I ka pohaku a ke kanaka. We didn't want to leave out the fish ponds or the limu and the moon. Mahalo.
Wow, chicken skin. It's definitely an intimidating start to a talk. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm really happy that you're here and you're hanging in, and they've left me to the end, and I usually take an hour or two to do this by myself. So bear with me while I try to speed it up so people can get home before midnight tonight. I've been tasked with kind of the unenviable task of talking about bleaching impacts specific to our reefs here on Maui. But I wanted to wrap it up with a little bit more of a positive note and give you a little bit of input into what our division is thinking and what are kind of our management priorities and plans moving forward. And any of you who've been involved with resource management over the last few years understands that it's not something that the Division of Aquatic Resources can do on our own. Okay? It really, really, really depends on public involvement. No matter what rules or what management actions we propose, there are many, many, many people against them. And those are the people that usually come out and let us know. So just bear that in mind. Please, please stay involved. Don't give up hope, no matter how depressing this presentation may be. So anytime I talk about coral bleaching, I think it's a good time to kind of step back and make sure everybody knows what we're talking about. As scientists, we sometimes get ahead of ourselves and assume everyone knows what we're talking about. So here's just a real quick picture graph. And the important thing to know is that there are photosynthetic cells, or dinoflagellates, that live within the coral tissue as symbionts. And the corals give them a place to live, and in exchange, they use the sunlight, photosynthesize, create sugars that is the major food source for a lot of these corals. Corals can also filter feed things from the ocean water and use that as a food source as well. But they depend greatly on that relationship with the zooxanthellae. And that kind of functions well in a certain temperature range. And when you start to exceed that temperature range, there's metabolites and other types of things that start to be produced, and we don't really understand exactly what's happening, but that relationship is no longer beneficial for the corals, and they get rid of those zooxanthellae. And that's what you see white corals. Okay, so the middle of the pictogram, you're seeing the skeleton of the coral through the transparent coral tissue. So the coral's still very much alive, but it's lost those photosynthetic cells that are reflecting the light that give them color. If that heat doesn't last too long, you can revert back, and the new zooxanthellae are recruited into the corals, and the coral returns back to normal. However, if it lasts a prolonged period of time, the corals start to starve to death, and they will ultimately die, and you'll start to see them be overgrown by turf algae. And that's what's happening on the right side. Okay, so that's coral bleaching in a nutshell. In 2015, we experienced really the first major mass bleaching event in Maui waters. Okay, in 2014, there was a little bit more bleaching that happened more north around Oahu and Kauai, and there was some examples of bleaching around Maui and the Big Island. But by and large, it was 2015 was a real wake-up call for us here. And this is one image of us running a transect along some coral reef that was obviously quite bleached. Now this is a graph that I usually spend about 45 minutes talking about in its entirety. So I'll spare you the long version, and just really quickly, these are coral monitoring sites where we're measuring and graphing and displaying, in this case, living coral cover on the bottom. So it's a two-dimensional exercise and just measuring how much of that bottom is covered with living coral. And then we can look at real broad scales in terms of, is there less coral over time, or is there more coral, or is it staying more or less the same? In this graph, black is generally good because it's staying the same. We have one site that's green is increasing, and then the red ones are not doing so well. But rather than talking about what's happening with all of these sites, I wanted to hone in on just three of them. The Kaikili, or Northern Kaanapali site, the Oluwalu site, and Molokini. And these sites all had a fair amount of coral cover, and you can see in the area that's circled there, a little decline, obvious decline in the last 3 years or so. So this happened subsequent to 2015. I can't really see too well here, hold on. So there's each one of these graphs represents a shallow site and a deep site. So the Kaikili site had a 28% decrease in coral cover on the shallow site and a 10% decrease in the deeper site. The Oluwalu site really took it the worst in 2015. The shallow site had a 67% decrease in coral cover in that 1 year, basically, following the bleaching, and 35% in the deeper site. And then Molokini declined 14% in the shallow site and 5% in the deeper site. So all of these sites we focused in on because the coral cover tended to be relatively good, 30% or more. Molokini is close to 70 or 80%. Oluwalu in that 40% range. Yet we saw significant declines, but there's still a lot of coral there left. One of the things that's interesting about these bleaching events is it's not one size fits all. You don't have this effect across all reefs around the islands. And here, NOAA did some towed diver surveys to kind of get a sense in 2015 of where the bleaching was most severe. And you can see there's areas like around La Perouse and Ahi Canal, there was very little bleaching at all. And as you went further north around Maui, around the point, Honoko'ai and so forth, there was very little bleaching. But there are spots in between where the bleaching was quite severe. Oluwalu was the worst along that leeward coast of Maui. And you can see a similar situation on Lanai. I just want to show you real quick some images of that, just so you get a sense of how bad that event was and how obvious it was, particularly if you were not out in the water during that time frame. So this is October 31st at Molokini. You can see everything was white. And really when you dove into these reefs like Molokini, it was kind of disorienting. It's hard to explain, but it certainly did not feel like you were diving in a coral reef. It felt more like a winter wonderland, kind of like a snow-covered mountain. It was just very, very different. One of the most devastating things that we noticed that year was that these really large lobe corals, big massive Porites lobata corals, were bleaching and dying, quite a bit of them, particularly in areas like Oluwalu. And there's the story of Big Mama, which is a large coral in Oluwalu that was sampled by the U.S. Geological Surveys. And it's about 4 meters or so across, estimated probably to be somewhere in the 300 to 400, maybe a little bit older than that time frame in terms of one living coral colony. So that's kind of alarming if you think about something that's been around for 400 years and it's gone through all of the events that have happened over that 400 years. And in that 1 year with that temperature event, it completely died. Here's just a few other examples of showing how it progressed, where you had some corals like this at Molokini, some rice coral, bleached. Later part of October, you start to see it dying and being overgrown with algae. By November, most of that coral was dead and overgrown. And then if you went back in just January, a few months later, there was very little sign that there ever was a coral there. So that's the kind of things we were seeing on some of these reefs, independent colonies. Unfortunately, cauliflower coral that a lot of people see and can relate to, and it creates a lot of good habitat for different animals, doesn't do well in these bleaching events. And what's interesting here is the Pasillopora meandrina, or the cauliflower coral, are the smaller ones, and in the same genus, the Udui or the antler coral, they all bleach the same, but as you look at the progression, the Udui or the antler coral came right back to normal. So there's a lot of variability between species, and even within the species. When some of them will bleach completely and they still come back. What I want to show you here is just kind of a little blip into some technology and how it's helping us really understand these changes on the reefs and understanding kind of how that affects the reefscape and how individual corals are being affected and so forth. So this is work that was kind of first initiated by some of our colleagues at Scripps, and it's now very commonly used. It just came from a conference on Oahu today, and there's many, many people doing this. They gave it a cool name, structure from motion, you know, and they're all different techniques of doing this. But what they do here is they have two cameras mounted together, and in this case, one's like a wide angle and one's a telephoto, and they swim back and forth like they're mowing the lawn. And they have fancy facial recognition software and amazing computers that then take all of these images that they're collecting automatically as they swim back and forth and stitch it together, as you're seeing on the right side. And so what they effectively can do is cover a big area of reef and completely map it out. And I'm just going to zip through here so you get a sense of what that looks like. So here's a section of reef. They did this photo mosaic or structure from motion kind of thing. And then on the computers, you basically have a 3D recreation of that reef. And that's really important because it allows you to see not just that two-dimensional straight down picture, but to really get down and around and see all of that reef structure. And then you can measure changes in that reef in terms of complexity. How does that reef over time change in terms of that structure and habitat that's there, rather than just looking at it from one dimension. You take these things and they have marked off little sections so they can make sure they're looking at the same section of reef year after year. Then you can go and you can kind of digitize or mark off the coral colonies you're interested in this case, Parietes lobata. And if you can go back to the same place again, so they went, this first on the left is 2014, they went back 2016, you can do the same thing, get rid of all the noise and just look at those layers of corals that you're interested in. And in this way, you can really clearly see what's starting to happen, right? So corals on the left, you can see they become smaller and more fragmented on the right, and particularly the big circle on the bottom demonstrates that. Then as scientists, they like to do some more fancy analysis and create graphs, and really don't want to get into the details here other than the fact that this is looking at the size frequency distribution of these coral colonies. And on the top, it's before the bleaching event, and on the bottom, it's after. So you can see that there's been a dramatic shift to the left towards smaller size colonies. And that has a lot of implications towards the overall resiliency of the reef. In fact, if you just look at the mean before and after, 60 centimeters squared was the mean size of these corals before, 30 after, so about half the size. So let's shift real quickly to looking at 2019. So this is thrown together really quickly because it's still ongoing and we're still crunching the data from this. We were lucky enough to partner with Arizona State, Greg Asner's group, and they did a kind of a citizen science thing, so there you can go online, you can see what people are reporting. But this here is bleaching surveys that our DAR team has done throughout the state. And it's really quick, qualitative little measures of the prevalence of bleaching. You zoom in on Maui, you can see red is bad. That's more than 76% of the corals bleached. Green, okay, and you know, the oranges and yellows are all kind of bad too. And the real take home here is that it's kind of patchy. There's no real rhyme or reason. There's some bad spots here and there. By and large, 2019 was not as bad as we thought it might be. And I gotta hurry up, and I got some really cool stuff here. So let's try to get through this. So what's happening temperature-wise? 2015 is the orange line. 2019 is the red line. We were very alarmed in August because we saw 2019 temperatures blast right past that dotted line, which is the bleaching threshold, and look significantly worse than what we were experiencing in 2015. Luckily, it plateaued out and didn't get as hot as it did in 2015, and that's probably why the effects were not as bad as we had anticipated. However, one of the interesting things is this year's coral temperature stayed above the bleaching threshold for a longer period of time than it did in 2015. And that has implications when you think about what really drives the bleaching, right? So it's called, they put it into this unit, degree heating week. So it's not just how hot it gets, but it's how long it stays hot. And you can look at these max thermal stress graphs in 2015 and 2019. You can see in 2015, there was a lot of red south of the state. The Big Island really got it bad on that west coast. And there was a fair amount of that red and yellows coming in around Maui. 2019, we still had some red right up on the Big Island, and then sections that, particularly on the western part of Maui, that appeared to get a fair amount of that. Quick observations: some corals are more likely to bleach, and we see them really quickly. And the bleaching was fairly substantial, particularly in 2015. Rice corals, cauliflower corals, lobe corals. They don't seem to bleach as quickly, but unfortunately in 2015, when they did, mortality was a lot higher. And that's when we saw these large colonies in Oluwalu, for example. From the work that Scripps and others have done, it's clear that small colonies experience higher mortality rates, while larger colonies experience higher rates of fragmentation, right? So that sets us up for future events being more problematic. If your large coral colonies are being turned into small colonies, they're going to have less resilience to future bleaching. And then bleaching prevalence is very variable, and there's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason for that. Much of it could be ocean currents, it could be sedimentation and shading effects near shore, et cetera. 2019, temperatures weren't as severe. Montipora and Passalopora still bleached very white. It's really too early to know the full extent of this, but by and large, we don't think it was nearly as bad as 2015, so that's good. All right, out of time, and this is really important stuff, so I'm going to zip through this real quick. What is our management focus and priorities moving forward? Well, this, unfortunately, is what we're looking forward to. Okay, you can see the events that occurred recently in 2015 and in 2019, the projected temperature rise, and that bleaching threshold, right? So by the year 2030, we're pretty much going to be exceeding that bleaching threshold all the time. Now, if that bleaching threshold stays stagnant, we're in trouble. However, we know, and we've learned from the other speakers tonight, there's a lot of things we can do to make reefs more resilient, for these things to adapt and adjust. And so there's no reason to believe that bleaching threshold will stay stagnant, right? It's more about buying time for these reefs and these corals to adjust and adapt to make their tolerance to that temperature go up, at least quickly enough to keep up with these increasing temperatures. With that in mind, we've done a lot of planning about how to help reefs recover after bleaching. We've identified some priority areas to work on that. We've come up with management goals or actions that we can take, and we've vetted these through various experts. What I want to point out here, though, is that there's things that can be done relatively quickly with support. Establishing bag limits and other types of restrictions for parrotfish and other important herbivores, like you heard from Dr. Hixon earlier, the importance of that. Prohibiting fishing methods that are excessively efficient at taking these things out of the water, like spear fishing and lay nets. Establishing herbivore management areas where it makes sense, like we did in Kaikili or the North Kaanapali area. These are things we can do relatively quickly, and they have a fairly quick effect. Other things we are doing, but they take longer, right? So we can't count on them to make the, to keep up with how bad things are getting as quickly. Reducing sediments, reducing nutrients, transplanting resistant corals, things we are working on. Enhancing enforcement, we're always working on that as well, trying to get compliance through other means as well. There are other things that may be a little bit more difficult politically, maybe take a little longer, but they're still doable if they need to be, right? We don't ever really want to prohibit all harvest of these fish. Harvesting of the fish is important culturally, it's important for people to sustain themselves. And then the establishment of no-take areas is an important management tool, but it's not one that the fishing public in general supports. So we have to work on that, build trust, and hopefully start to integrate some of these things into the future. And I just want to kind of leave it with this overall initiative from the governor that I think is important we keep linking back to this Aloha Plus Challenge. And there's different initiatives and goals in this, but the one that's really important is these watershed protection and the marine manage initiative. And under these initiatives, we were working really hard to kind of come up with plans of action, get support from political leaders, and move forward. You're going to start hearing more about this. There's going to be scoping and informational meetings about this 30 by 30 initiative and what it means and trying to get support and interest from the public. I want to leave you guys with that, what I started off with. None of these management initiatives will ever work, will ever get put in place without support from you all. So it's very, very important you continue to pay attention, you don't lose hope, and you continue to hold your government agencies and your government leaders accountable and demand change. If you do that, I promise we'll keep chugging along, trying to make it happen along with you. And with that, I'm way over time, so I apologize, but at least it didn't take an hour. Right?
Thank you, Russell, especially for that call to action and try to help out on the political side to get some movement to help protect our reefs. So I want to invite our speakers back up here, please, and Sharon.
We have a closing oli.
Okay.
We're normal, regular, everyday peeps who have the ike and the spirit of our ancestors who walked the broad path before us. And we can choose to be kupono and make good choices for the future. We learned a lot listening backstage, what we could hear. And it's a call to action. So mahalo nui for having us here tonight.
Tonight was a blending of culture and science. You don't see that often. Science is awesome science, but it can be better by adding that cultural layer that sometimes a lot of scientists forget. But these scientists, they got them down. So thank you for everybody for sharing that. So please hand for our speakers tonight. So we've come to the end of our program. We don't have enough time for a Q&A session. The speakers have to catch a flight back to Oahu. But I wanted to thank the Office of Economic Development, Maui Ocean Center Marine Institute, Iao Theater, our speakers, and all of the attendees. Please give yourselves a big round of applause. And we'll see you on November 13th for those of you who want to come to the Sphere. So mahalo to our speakers. Please give them another round, please. Mahalo.